Yeah. All right. So this is the meeting of the Climate Council Subcommittee on a Just Transition. And today is Thursday, and it is June 16th. Thank you all for being here. We're going to quickly look at our agenda, which is pretty straightforward. We're going to check in on our notes. We're going to review what happened in the legislature and what didn't happen in the legislature. Marion, is that something that you are going to do with us? Just checking.
I have a quick slide I can show, and then I will likely spend most of our time talking about the EJ bill.
Okay. We're going to have an update about the Climate Council as a whole, including what's happening in our task groups and work groups. And also sort of those, especially around public engagement, metrics, and transportation. Marion, is that going to be you again?
I'm not sure, Sue. I just got back from vacation, so
okay.
it was not
We're
the drafting of this
Marion.
agenda.
I'm reporting out for metrics.
Okay. Okay, so full disclosure, Marion is just back from vacation. And Jane was here last week when Abby and the gang met, and I was not at the meeting, so that's why it may sound a little discombobulated. So we'll figure it out, and then we're going to offer a time for the public to speak, and then we're really going to think about our own priorities and make sure we have a plan and some priorities for where we go from here. But we also have Rachel, we have some guests from A&R, and I guess I'm of the impression that you're going to be doing a presentation.
Yeah, I'm going to help present out on the environmental justice bill, and then Megan and I are going to present out for transportation task group on the rulemaking.
Got it. Thank you for making that clear. Any questions or thoughts about that agenda? Terrific. I want to just give a minute to the notes. Those are also on the chat, in the chat, so check them out. As always, thank you, Amanda, for your diligence in note-taking and sharing. And if we have no comments, I'm going to assume that we accept those notes.
Can we accept them without a quorum, or do we just need to review them?
Oh, that's such a good question. Let's just review them and see if there's any comments.
And here's
Ooh,
Kashka.
Kashka, you have zoomed in at the absolute most important moment, because we have to do our first and probably only real thing of note, which is to accept our minutes. So you have you've made the quorum possible. Thank you, Kashka.
Thank you. I was rushing to be able to be parked while
right.
my kid does her thing. So.
Yes, and I'm very glad you're not driving and meeting. Okay, so without any comments, we're going to just accept those, acknowledge that as an acceptance of the meeting, of the minutes to the last meeting. Very good. Great. All right. And I'm sorry, Marion, for putting you on the spot. I forgot that you've been away. And let's move to sort of the big picture of what happened and didn't in the legislature, and then a presentation on the EJ bill. And I'll hand it to you. Thank you.
Sure. So I have just two quick slides to show. Folks may have already seen some of these. They've been presented at the council meeting, but we do have a bit of an update. And the two slides I'll show, one is the first one up on the screen here, is really just a reflection on those budget items that were passed and approved with the budget. A lot were focused on using ARPA funds, so the American Rescue Plan Act dollars for one-time funds towards a number of specific initiatives as recommended by the Climate Council. And then a couple were also identified for one-time general funds. You'll see it covers the board here. While a lot is focused on greenhouse gas mitigation through electrification, weatherization, electrical upgrades, there are also funds allocated towards hazard mitigation buyouts, natural and working lands resilience, municipal building fuel switching, so focus both on greenhouse gas mitigation and resilience initiatives, as well as money going towards environmental justice and the creation of a climate office. So this is, I'll put the link in the chat to this. I think it's online from a couple council meetings ago, but wanted to reshare this with folks so you're aware of really the status of those budget items as related to climate action work from the specific recommendations that came out of the climate action plan. And then the other is an update. I did a funny job here just a minute ago in updating the slide, but wanted to highlight a number. These aren't all of the bills that were related to recommendations in the climate action plan, but a number of the key pieces of legislation. We're at the point where all of these have either been signed or vetoed, so we're not waiting on any of these particular pieces. You'll note here, there are a few that didn't make it through both bodies. Those will have the NA in the last column there. Those are ones related to the planning office, transportation emissions, changes to Act 250 and the Transportation and Climate Initiative. There are a number of initiatives that were passed by both houses and signed by the governor. The first, which is where we'll hear a bit more on that from Rachel in just a moment, S148, the act relating to environmental justice. H518 is an act related to the creation of a municipal fuel switching program. Will provide money for municipalities to do fuel switching in their municipal buildings. That was signed by the governor. An act related to hydrofluorocarbons, and an act related to the creation of ecological management qualification for the use value appraisal program were all signed. And then there were a couple of two listed here that were vetoed by the governor, H606, which is an act related to community resilience and biodiversity protection, and then H715, which is the clean heat standard. So wanted to highlight these for you all. We're going to spend most of our time today hearing from Rachel and talking about the environmental justice law that was passed and signed by the governor, but did want to highlight these for you all today as a couple of other key initiatives that have now sort of made it through the legislative process for this session. So that is what I have. And with that, I will stop sharing. Happy to take questions, but I think we'll want to spend most of our time talking about the EJ bill. Questions from folks? If not, I'll hand it over to you, Rachel.
Well, I have a question. And welcome, Chris. I guess one of my questions relates to the first, and you may not know the answer, but a curiosity about there's big numbers, big amounts of resources allocated for a whole variety of things. And I'm wondering kind of who is most of the decision making about the use and the implementation of that in the sort of the administration's camp? Or is there anything that we might have input into? And is that part of what we're thinking about as we talk about engagement moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sue. And I don't have a full answer, but I will say, and if you want to have a specific question about one of these specific initiatives, and there are other folks on the phone from other state agencies who can probably fill in more details than I can. A lot of this is allocated to specific state agencies for implementation and carrying out specific programs. So I think it's, recommendations that came through the climate action plan, through lobbying and advocacy from organizations around the state, but is then being allocated to state agencies to actually implement. So I don't know how much room there is for feedback from the Just Transition Subcommittee specifically beyond the work that's been allocated and money that's been allocated for like public engagement for climate office, for example. And it hasn't been that specific, but I think that may be a space where there's some discussion that could take place with the Just Transition Subcommittee, but most of this is allocated to specific programs across state government to implement. So anyway, not a great answer. I think a lot of this, though, is sort of already allocated and is being planned and implemented with specific state agencies, and not so much tied to work from the Climate Council. But Abby and Sarah probably have more detail than I do, so go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Abby, and then Sarah.
I actually have a lot of detail. I was more going to ask a similarly related question of just how is everyone feeling, either from the climate team or otherwise about the successes of the legislative session? Are you feeling like we had some really great wins, there was a few disappointments, generally feeling pretty optimistic? I just wanted to get kind of just like a general sense and feel of how the CAP may be shaping up to be being addressed from the priorities and approved laws of this past session.
That's a tough question. I think it depends a little who you ask. I will say, and actually we have Dave Farnsworth and Chris Campany on the call today, who are both on the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. Cross-sector mitigation spent a lot of time today reflecting on really the losses in the space of the Transportation Climate Initiative and the failure of the Clean Heat Standard to pass and what to do in those areas. Those were really the two largest policy recommendations in the Climate Action Plan for greenhouse gas reduction, greenhouse gas mitigation. So I think in that sense, there's really a need to reflect and figure out what steps to take next. On the flip side, though, there's a lot of money, I think you saw the numbers on the screen, going towards weatherization, going towards hazard mitigation buyouts, money going towards, beyond just the scope of greenhouse gas mitigation. So in that sense, there really are some big wins. So I think it depends who you ask, and the council and the steering committee are going to be taking some time, mostly the steering committee this summer, and reflecting on what are the next steps and how do we strategize and prioritize for the next legislative session. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking more towards Sue's question. Is this working okay? All right, hopefully. Thank you. Sue's question around, is there opportunity to influence, is what I was taking as your question, Sue. And I kind of think there is in a couple ways. One is that we have, and I say this as both a member of the subcommittee and an implementer, right? Because our office is responsible for implementing low-income weatherization program. So I think one thing is that the just transitions, our assessment, right, that we created, our questions, our guiding principles and our questions, I think that's a great tool for implementers. And as actually a lot of the feedback that we got from the Climate Council was that it was really more at the level of implementation. And so I wonder, to that extent, I think we could think about how do we support, and we want the administration, we want the executive branch, right? We want implementers to be using those principles. That's part of what we've said already. So I wonder if we could think about what kind of support we could provide around that. And I'll just, like, some random ideas could be like training. We could do like a workshop for members of the administration, where we invite them, people who are responsible for doing these things, right? So that's one thought. The other thought I had is around the outreach and engagement, because I know, again, as an implementer, like, we already sit at a lot of tables where other people are advising us and engaging with us. And we know that we haven't been doing enough engagement around impacted and marginalized communities, right? So we could go out and start doing that, but you then have like 20 different initiatives where people are all independently going out trying to do more outreach and engagement. Whereas we have a climate office now that's going to have capacity to do engagement work. What about coordinating some of that engagement through the climate office? And I think that's something our subcommittee could discuss and influence. So those are two things that I think could have real on the ground kind of impact in terms of influencing how that money gets implemented.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
Hey there. One of the things I brought up in, and Sarah, you may be able to help with this, that I brought up during the cross-sector mitigation, is that I keep forgetting the act number. I think it's 518, which is the Municipal Resilience Act, about helping weatherize municipal buildings, help them switch away from fossil fuels. RPCs have a role in helping the towns with that. The lead on it is buildings and operations. And the concern that was raised with us was they're not sure that what's in the act is ARPA eligible. And I would have hoped before the act passed that would have been clarified, but I know there have already been a number of weatherization and green energy and other grants, I think, and other programs during this whole ARPA period. So the only reason I bring it up is, Sarah, if your agency, TJ was on there from Department of Public Service. I'm hoping all the different pieces, parts of government are talking to each other, but if you have information, you may want to reach out to the commissioner. Peter Gregory and I are going to be the points of contact for the RPCs with buildings and operations. But the other thing that we're proposing is give priority to, I can't remember if this is in the act or not, but we're proposing is give priority to the most in need communities. The challenge is, as I recall, and I may be wrong on this, under ARPA's definition, I think it looks very much like USDA's definition of like low income communities, which frankly, as I recall, there are very few of those in Vermont. It's like the poorest of the poor. Abby, you might have insight into that. Because I just know for the most part, like when it comes to eligibility for USDA grants, none of the towns in our region qualify, and we're one of the poorer, I think, regions in the state. So anyway, just stay tuned. There may be some hiccups. I hope not. I hope that, you know, we're having a meeting soon. I hope all this is clarified. There's not going to be any issues, but just kind of wanted to give everybody a heads up that it may not be completely smooth sailing on some of the acts that got through the legislature.
Thank you. And
Not being critical at all, just trying to, I know it's hard to nail all that stuff down when they're working on the legislation.
there's a lot of money that got allocated. I think there's a long way to go from here to there. I think there are ways we can be involved. And I want to just put a pin on this. And I think these are the topics we can talk about at the end of our meeting when we're talking about our work plan. So let's remember the ideas that we just discussed. And I want to give time to the folks who are here to really get into detail about the Just Transitions bill. I'm sorry, the environmental justice bill, because some of that will influence what we want to do moving forward. There's a lot of content, and yes, I think you did a good job, Marion, of saying there are things that didn't happen this legislative session that are an enormous disappointment and essentially put the ability to meet the required GHG reductions at great risk. And a lot did pass, and a lot of money is being allocated to help us move forward on a number of fronts. So be that as it may, let's learn about, unless there are any other comments about, you know, sort of that big picture view of what got passed and what didn't. I want to suggest we focus for a moment on what got passed, a very significant bill about which we want to learn more and probably could influence what we want to do next. So Rachel, is that you're going to take it from here, I guess?
Yeah, and
Thank you.
I'd ask you and Marion how much time you'd like to spend. I mean, this topic or this bill could take the time that you have.
Yeah,
So,
we do have until sort of 5. Oh, why don't you spend, I guess, why don't you spend half an hour on this?
okay, yeah, I mean, this is just mostly going to be, I don't think it will take that
40,
long, but
45, yeah.
Well, you and Megan both have to leave at 5, is that correct?
yeah. And
So we'll
I
want to
def-
make sure that we can do the EJ bill and the overview of the rulemaking public engagement piece in the next.
Let me see how
35
far we can
minutes.
get in 15 minutes, leave some space for questions, and then maybe we just move to the next, because I definitely want to make sure we get input on the rulemaking too. So I'm going to share my screen. I put the slides I'm just going to walk through in the chat. Let me see. Let me know what you're seeing. Are you seeing slides?
We see your slides.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, it's actually a PDF, I guess. I'm not going to, I'm just going to skim through here. But so a significant, I should introduce myself. I'm Rachel Stevens. I'm an Associate General Counsel at the Agency of Natural Resources. I use she, her pronouns. And before joining the agency in December, I was a staff attorney and a professor in the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School. which is the other forum through which I participated in this committee. So I'm glad to be back and working on this. So this is just intended to be a bill overview. So all the information in this slide is actual text from the law itself. This isn't really an overview of what A&R is doing. This is just to give you kind of a high level version of the law. But if you do have questions, let me know. And between me and Carrie, hopefully we can try to answer your questions. So the bill was referred to as S148 during the session and now has an act number, Act 154. This is an act related to environmental justice in Vermont. This is a snapshot of the bill itself and the structure. The first section of the bill is findings. This is about 7 pages of findings in the environmental justice law that the legislature found. I think it is worth reviewing in terms of the basis for the law, the reasons why this was an issue that the legislature decided to address. And it is a pretty lengthy findings document, so I do think it's worth reviewing. The second section involves the meat of the bill. These are the section numbers so that you can go back through the bill itself. There's a purpose statement, which we'll talk about. There are some definitions which are definitely applicable to the work of this committee and the work of state government. The environmental justice state policy, which now applies to all of state government. Some components implementing the state policy. Next steps for rulemaking and a timeline. This is rulemaking as it relates to the Agency of Natural Resources. It also creates an Environmental Justice Advisory Council and an Interagency Environmental Justice Committee and an Environmental Justice Mapping Tool. There's also a requirement for state agencies to prepare and submit spending reports. Section 4 discusses the appropriations for the law, which included some funding for development of a mapping tool and for hiring staff at the Agency of Natural Resources to implement the law, and the effective date, which is next month. Let me know if you want me to slow down. I'm just going to keep cruising here. So this is the purpose statement from the law. The purpose of this chapter is to identify, reduce, and eliminate environmental health disparities to improve the health and well-being of all Vermont residents. So one of the topics that's really important to understanding the implementation and of the law are the definitions. So there are, I should have put an overview here. There are several definitions, which I'll put on the screen. There's a definition for environmental justice. There's the definition for environmental justice focused population, limited English proficiency, environmental benefits, environmental burdens, and meaningful participation. So I'm going to skim through these now so that you can review these. My understanding is that the text of these definitions were substantially created by community members and stakeholders. This was something that was discussed in the legislative committee and wasn't didn't deviate too far from the original definitions that were introduced in the original version of the bill. I'll just read the first part here if it's helpful. Environmental justice means all individuals are afforded equitable access to and distribution of environmental benefits, equitable distribution of environmental burdens, and fair and equitable treatment and meaningful participation in decision-making processes, including the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Environmental justice recognizes the particular needs of individuals of every race, color, income, class, ability status, gender identity, sexual orientation, national origin, ethnicity or ancestry, religious belief, or English language proficiency level. Environmental justice redresses structural and institutional racism, colonialism, and other systems of oppression that result in the marginalization, degradation, disinvestment, and neglect of Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. Environmental justice requires providing a proportional amount of resources for community revitalization, ecological restoration, resilience planning, and a just recovery to communities most affected by environmental burdens and natural disasters. I think we can all agree this is statutory language. And this is now the definition that applies for our environmental justice population. So I think this is a pretty significant definition for us to consider. Environmental justice focused population. This refers to like the communities. There are some, which I'll talk about in implementing the bill, there are some requirements to kind of direct investments and to consider environmental burdens on specific populations. And as of now, this is the definition. I say as of now because the law does contemplate that the Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the Interagency Committee can recommend new definitions or changes to existing definitions based on community input or other information that they gather once they form as in terms of entities. As you can see, this definition is based on demographics at the census block group level, and it's based on household income, it's based on race and limited English proficiency level. And this is an or. So any one of these could trigger being considered an environmental justice focused population. The next definition is limited English proficiency. This is also based on US Census data. This means that a household does not have a member 14 years or older who speaks English, quote, very well as defined by the census. This is the definition of environmental benefits. It means the assets and services that enhance the capability of communities and individuals to function and flourish in society. Examples of environmental benefits include access to a healthy environment and clean natural resources, including air, water, land, green spaces, constructed playgrounds and other outdoor recreational facilities and venues, affordable, clean, renewable energy sources, public transportation, fulfilling and dignified green jobs, healthy homes and buildings, healthcare, nutritious food, indigenous food and cultural resources, environmental enforcement and training, and funding dispersed or administered by governmental agencies. I saw a hand. Did someone have a question? Okay, this is an important definition. One of the things I'm going to talk about is the requirement for directing investments toward environmental justice populations, and it's based on investments that result in environmental benefits. This is, I'll explain that a little bit more in the implementation phase, but this is just want to flag this as an important definition under the law. Environmental burdens, this is kind of the other side of the policy in terms of, avoiding disproportionate environmental burdens and equitable environmental benefits. This is the kind of the flip side of that. Means any significant impact to clean air, water, and land, including any destruction, damage, or impairment of natural resources resulting from intentional or reasonably foreseeable causes. Examples of environmental burdens include climate change impacts, air and water pollution, improper sewage disposal, improper handling of solid waste and other noxious substances, excessive noise, activities that limit access to green spaces, nutritious food, indigenous food or cultural resources, or constructed outdoor playgrounds and other recreational facilities and venues, inadequate remediation of pollution, reduction of groundwater levels, increased flooding or stormwater flows, home and building health hazards, including lead paint, lead plumbing, asbestos and mold, and damage to inland waterways and water bodies, wetlands, forests, green spaces, or constructed playgrounds or other outdoor recreational facilities and venues from private, industrial, commercial, or government operations or other activities that contaminate or alter the quality of the environment and pose a risk to public health. And the last definition I wanted to share is this definition of meaningful participation. This definition means, or this term means that all individuals have the opportunity to participate in energy, climate change, and environmental decision-making. Examples include needs assessments, planning, implementation, permitting, compliance, and enforcement and evaluation. Meaningful participation also integrates diverse knowledge systems, histories, traditions, languages, and cultures of indigenous communities in decision-making processes. It requires that communities are enabled and administratively assisted to participate fully through education and training. Meaningful participation requires the state to operate in a transparent manner with regard to opportunities for community input and also encourages the development of environmental energy, and climate change stewardship. Again, these are all definitions in the law that apply statewide and are used in the law itself. So I'm going to turn to the policy statement. This is now the EJ state policy that applies to all of state government. It says, it is the policy of the state of Vermont that no segment of the population of the state should, because of its racial, cultural, or economic makeup, bear a disproportionate share of environmental burdens or be denied an equitable share of environmental benefits. It is further the policy of the state of Vermont to provide the opportunity for the meaningful participation of all individuals with particular attention to environmental justice focused populations in the development, implementation, or enforcement of any law, regulation, or policy. I want to pause here. This is a very sweeping policy statement. Just want to make sure anyone have questions so far. Okay, keep moving. Oh, Kashka.
Sorry about that. I do have a question real quick. So when you were describing the definition for English proficiency, the only thing I wanted to ask, and it just put something in my mind, it did say English speaking. So anybody in the household that's 14 years and older who doesn't speak English, but I know plenty of households that can speak English somewhat, but do not read or write.
Yeah, so this is the definition that the environmental justice, that the legislature decided on, but our agency also has, is developing a language access policy that involves potentially broader resources for broader communities and also people that don't read or write, or people with communication needs, such as hard of hearing or other things. So I think the law itself just addresses, the definition that was stated above. But the agency natural resources considers language. Yeah, we have civil rights obligations that recognizes, language access requirements that are more broad than necessarily the state definition.
Okay. Great, thank you so much for clarifying.
Yeah, and so I would say that that definition is in the case of this law is only to determine environmental justice population. That's the only time it's used or applied in this law itself, but each agency, can consider language access beyond that.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Chris.
In the world of Vermont planning case law, we've been directed to say for policies really to have substantial, significant standing in Act 250 or Section 248, that the language should read shall. And I'm just curious, where it says it is the policy of the state of Vermont that no segment of the population of the state should, because it was racial, yada, yada, yada. Is there any way that should is an escape clause as opposed to shall? Because I'm just curious in the legal world, the difference between should, shall, will not. Any thoughts on that? That
was not the intention, I think, of this statement. There is some, all lawyers can tell you there are important terms for shall. I guess this could have been written in the negative, so shall not, bear a disproportionate share. My impression from the discussion was that this was intended to be mandatory and a clear requirement. And there is definitely shall language in terms of implementation of the policy, where those mandates and timelines are firm mandates. So that might become more clear in terms of implementation of the policy. But that's a good question. I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time so we can get to some other items. So these are the covered agencies. When I say covered agencies, there's kind of two ways this comes up. These are the agencies that are going to be participating in the interagency committee that's formed under the law. In addition to this list of agencies, the executive director of racial equity is also a member of the interagency committee. These are also the covered agencies that have requirements under the law in terms of implementing the policy. So they participate in the interagency committee and have affirmative requirements to implement the law. I'm going to just keep moving. There are several, there's a huge list of items required to implement the EJ law. I'm highlighting the 3 kind of high level takeaways, but I definitely encourage you to dig into the law itself to see all the list of requirements and deadlines that are in the bill or in the law. The first kind of main area of requirement is the requirement that covered agencies create and adopt community engagement plans. The second is related to a requirement that all of the covered agencies direct investments with environmental benefits proportionally to environmental justice focused populations. This second element, there are several steps to this process. First is that the Agency of Natural Resources is going to develop a guidance about which, to help determine which investments lead to environmental benefits and how to implement this policy. There's also a requirement that these covered agencies do a 3-year look back to look at their actual spending to see whether there were any like portions of municipalities or communities that were potentially underserved by those investments. And then there's a requirement, I think it's by 2025, to actually direct investments. The key term is proportionally to environmental justice focused populations. The third major implementation of the bill is this requirement that covered agencies consider cumulative environmental burdens and access to environmental benefits when making decisions. This is a pretty meaty requirement, and this also has a multi-stepped approach. Cumulative environmental burdens is not defined in the law itself, though environmental burdens is. And the next step, I'll just move onto this slide, is that the Agency of Natural Resources, in consultation with the 2 bodies formed under the law, will issue guidance about how to determine the investments and also adopt rules to first define cumulative environmental burdens, to explain how to implement this consideration of cumulative environmental burdens, and to inform how the public and covered agencies can implement this consideration and use the environmental justice mapping tool that will be created. I'm going to keep moving for the sake of time, but I'll put my contact information in the chat if you have follow-up questions. These are the 2 bodies that are created under the law. One thing I wanted to flag for this subcommittee is that there is a requirement in the law that both the advisory council and the and the interagency committee shall consider and incorporate the guiding principles for a just transition into their work. So I wanted to flag that for this group. And there's the law outlines the diversity of members of these various committees and who appoints those members, the terms, and more information about how these bodies will be formed, the number of meetings, all of that is in the law itself. One exciting piece is the development of an environmental justice mapping tool that the agency will develop. It will depict indices, or it will include indices and criteria to depict environmental justice focused populations and measure environmental burdens at the smallest geographic level practicable. I think this will be a tool that will help with this group's work and also the work of environmental justice across state government. So just wanted to put some context information here. Obviously, Carrie is our point of contact for the Department of Environmental Conservation. Carla Ramundi is the central contact for the agency. She oversees our environmental justice and civil rights compliance. The Agency of Natural Resources is undergoing an internal strategic planning process right now to think through the next steps for implementing the law. So we intend to have environmental justice liaisons in each of the departments, and we can share more information about who to contact and next steps on strategic planning and implementation from there. So I know we're at time, Sue, for this agenda item, but I'll put my contact information in the chat and welcome folks to email me, or if there's any clarifying questions that I can answer right now, I can try to do that quickly.
Did Megan also want to participate in this section, or
I think we're going to just move into rulemaking.
Okay, well, so let's just check in quickly. Quick questions for Rachel's very helpful overview. There's a lot in there, and I hope everyone noticed that our guiding principles are literally in the law, and I want to thank all the people who testified about that. Any questions or clarifying? Otherwise, we should keep moving because we only have, I guess, another 10 minutes or so with Megan. All right. Thank you, Rachel. It's great that you are there. Having had you with us when we first explored what does environmental justice mean? And now here you are implementing. Okay, Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. Hi, everyone. So I'll be quick because I think a lot of you have heard this before. We've talked a lot about the rules that we're working on that were adopted in the climate action plan that directed the Agency of Natural Resources to go ahead and amend or adopt certain motor vehicle emission standards in the state of California. So this is expanding on an existing regulatory program that we have at the Agency of Natural Resources to regulate motor vehicle emissions. And is updating our rules to either add a requirement that we have kind of swifter and more stringent penetration of ZEV vehicles across the light, medium, and heavy duty fleets, or to amend the rule to increase that stringency in the case of the light duty vehicles. So just really briefly, for those that may not have been participating in the Climate Council meeting where we walk through this, advanced clean
By the
cars.
way, I would assume very few of us were
Okay,
there.
no worries.
Yeah, so
I'm
take your
happy
time.
happy to slow down a little bit and add more detail. So we, in the state of Vermont, we implement what are called our low and zero emission vehicle rule program. And this is a program that we adopt via authority that we have in the Clean Air Act. And the low emission side of that regulatory program controls criteria pollutant emissions, and criteria pollutants are, according to the Clean Air Act, these more kind of traditional air quality concerns related to nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxides, particulate matter, things like that. And then also greenhouse gas emissions. And then the zero emission component of that program is essentially a zero emission vehicle sales requirement, which is a requirement on manufacturers that they deliver for sale to the state of Vermont a certain percentage of their vehicles to be qualifying zero emission vehicles. So it guarantees that a certain percentage of the light duty fleet delivered to Vermont by these manufacturers that are that to which the law is applicable must be, cleaner vehicles. And these there's some plug-in hybrid vehicles that qualify as well, that kind of earn the manufacturers these credits towards complying with the law. So the Advanced Clean Cars 2 program amends that program, and it requires that by the year 2035, auto manufacturers deliver 100% of the passenger car and light duty trucks that they deliver for sale to the state of Vermont by 2035 will have to be zero emission vehicles. And I just want to be clear that this is a requirement on the auto manufacturers. It's not a consumer-based regulation. It's not a requirement that if you go shopping for a vehicle that you have to buy an electric car. It's a technology standard. It's a technology forcing regulation for the auto manufacturers. And that's a really common point of confusion. So we just want to make it really clear that we're not requiring consumers to behave differently. We're just giving them better access to the types of vehicles that will be lower or no emitting. And then there's also 3 rules that have to do with the medium and heavy duty vehicles that auto manufacturers deliver for sale. The Advanced Clean Trucks rule has another similar EV phase-in requirement depending on the weight class of the medium or heavy duty vehicle. And this ramps up over a number of years. The level of stringency isn't as strong as the light duty rule that I just mentioned, but that's recognizing the fact that the medium and heavy duty EV technology is slightly behind the smaller vehicles. But I think that will eventually be coming. And then the other 2 rules have to do with criteria pollutants for medium and heavy duty vehicles, and then also greenhouse gas emissions for medium and heavy duty vehicles, and efficiency standards for trailer manufacturers, so that tractor trailer trucks and the trailers that they tow behind them will be designed as efficiently as possible to reduce emissions. So those are the rules that we are currently working on pursuant to the direction we are given in the Climate Action Plan. And in the memo that Rachel provided to this subcommittee for the materials today, there is a requirement that in the Global Warming Solutions Act, the ANR meet a higher bar in terms of our public engagement for the rulemaking that we're required to do pursuant to the law. And there's some, it's somewhat vague, but also somewhat specific direction in the law. So we're trying to interpret that appropriately. And in doing so, we obviously would like the help of this committee in making sure that our interpretation is appropriate. So in the memo that Rachel provided, we listed some of the considerations that we've used in thinking about how we want to do public engagement in light of that requirement, and then also a proposal for some of the areas of the state, specific towns that we've identified based on a review of the different tools that we have to try to identify appropriate communities to really maximize our engagement and get really robust feedback. So I guess I'll turn it over to Rachel to expand on more about what our public engagement strategy is, but I think that's just kind of the gist of the rule. I guess before I turn over to Rachel, I'm going to mention a couple challenges. One is that the Clean Air Act requires that when we adopt these rules, we don't have any leeway in changing the substantive nature of the rule or the stringency of the rule. We have to adopt California's rule identically. And so usually when we do rulemaking, we use our public process as a way to get feedback from the public to potentially make substantive changes to the rule. And we can't do that here. So we view this as an opportunity to share valuable information with the public about what we're doing. And I think also to get feedback about how the public it might be concerned about the impacts of these rules and what the public needs to, or what they think ANR can do to adequately address these concerns that they might be identifying in terms of being impacted by these rules. So that's what we're hoping to get feedback on, since we can't make any substantive changes to the rule itself based on public input. I think the Climate Council went through that engagement process before they decided to direct ANR to adopt the rules. So that's just kind of the position that ANR is in at this point. And also looking for other ways or other topics that this subcommittee thinks would be valuable for us to engage the public on, kind of given that situation and given what the rule is requiring. So I'll turn it over to Rachel, and also happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, and I'm happy to, I'm going to stay on a little longer because I know we're breezing through this and there's a lot, you might have questions, so I can hang around a little bit if there's questions. But there's kind of three things that we wanted to maybe focus your feedback on, and welcome you all reaching out to us after this. So the thing we want to focus on, at least, in our public engagement planning, maybe with this group or, in the next 2 weeks, is the areas and locations for the public meetings that we're going to host on the rule, which are scheduled in September, to be in September. And actually, so do we have time? I could just share my screen to maybe facilitate discussion, maybe Kashka, while you ask your question. That might help.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Rachel. I just had a question. So the rules and the policies are already in place based on what the Climate Council, if I'm just understanding correctly, based on what the Climate Council on the CAP that came out. But to be completely honest, I don't think at that point there was a lot of public engagement that was done. And I think it would be unfair of us to assume or even state that there was a lot of public engagement before the CAP to really affect the rules and the policies that came out. So I just think that we really need to be careful with saying that there was, and even saying that the Climate Council had done so. I think it was it was a beginning of something. But certainly I think that it has a ways to go. So I'm just curious how the public engagement now would have an input, and what, is it just finding out how these are affecting people? Because if there's no change that's being made because of the public engagement or because of what you're hearing on the ground, then I don't really understand.
Katja, I think the issue is that the rulemaking is relative to California. We are adopting something that has already been passed in California. So that's who we have to match. That's why there's no room. So I think that Rachel's about to roll out what it is they want to hear from the public and us about. Is that correct, Megan?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think this is a legal technicality that is, related to federal, what's called preemption, which is, there's a very narrow way that Vermont is able to adopt standards that are more stringent than the federal standards. And it's by adopting the rules that have already been adopted in California, because they've been given a waiver by the federal government to adopt these more stringent standards. So Vermont is one of a group of states, somewhere between, I think, depending on which rules we're adopting, maybe between like 8 and 14, I think is the number, that have adopted California standards. So it's not that there's no, we are definitely going to be doing public engagement around the rules, but we are limited in terms of some of the like stringency or timeline of the rules, in terms of how we adopt the rule, because it has to be identical or else we're preempted by federal law. So it's a little bit of a technical issue there, but we really appreciate feedback on that, and welcome feedback about how we can communicate and still effectively engage the public given that legal limitation. Some of the ideas that Megan shared are, making sure that we get information about, how people may be impacted by a transition to zero emission vehicles, what they could need for that transition. And there is also a program that Megan and I are digging into related to environmental justice values and credits, that might be an opportunity for some input. So we're still fleshing that out and trying to determine like what the where the public can influence the process, but there are some legal limitations to this things that we could change in the rule. But we're definitely doing public engagement. That's very important to the agency, and it's required by law. So why don't I just share?
Hey, while you share that, Rachel, I'll just add something, because I saw Sarah's comment in the chat that says, what's the point? The question might be, what's the point of the engagement if, it's not flexible? And I actually had this same question. And I saw Megan last week at Willowwands in Montpelier standing in line. And I asked her that question, and she told me some things that like weren't as clear, because they're things that I think kind of got muddied up in all the regulatory stuff. But what I took away from it was in 2035, like I won't be able to buy a gasoline vehicle in Vermont.
That's new.
I know. And I was like, oh, like I didn't know that. So like, even though they can't change it, there's sort of some useful information here that I think could affect a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's right, Carrie. I think it's information sharing, and I think I think as Rachel's going to go into, there are, a few points where we do need some substantive feedback from the public on some very narrow areas where we do have flexibility, but then also to engage about like the complementary policies and the complementary needs of the public related to the rollout of this rule and the requirement that you just mentioned, which is, potentially going to be news to people for sure.
Especially I'm sorry, Rachel, especially the people that we're, making sure that their voices are being heard in this conversation. And environmental justice in itself comprises those that are overburdened. So I think this is really important. And just to make a point as well, and I understand that we had to adopt the California model, et cetera. I do understand some of the legalities surrounding that, although not all of them. However, look how California is doing. I mean, look at what's going on in California right now. We really have to consider and think about how we can make it better. And I understand there's legal parameters against us changing certain things, but then those parameters have to be changed. That is ridiculous that we can't change it to make them better, because California is not doing great. I have a lot of friends who live in California. And so I'm just curious, sorry.
No, I mean, I think this is a fair point, and this is definitely, I think this is a good point for discussion for the public and also for this group and for us as the agency. You know, our hands are tied in some ways in terms of what we can and have the authority to implement, but that doesn't mean that we're saying that there's not more to be done or to be discussed. And I think one thing that we can do is also to try to be clear about the forums. You know, there are going to be some public forums also in California this summer about some of their rules, and EPA is also hosting some forums about the authority that it gives to California that, you know, that could be additional information, maybe Megan, that we can share for folks who want to engage on this topic, and maybe to that broader question of why can't we do more, or what, you know, why are our hands tied in some ways. So, but take that point and feedback. I'm sharing my screen. I'm hoping you can see this. So I put on in the memo some information about the language about location of the public hearings that we're going to host later this year. And the law does say that a portion of these hearings should be in areas and communities that have the most significant exposure to the impacts of climate change, including disadvantaged, low income and rural communities. There's it's not totally clear how to determine which communities meet that definition, given that we don't have clear definitions. But Meg and I have worked to consider kind of this list of information that I've got here on the screen, and we've kind of identified what we think are maybe a good short list or a starting point for considering some locations of meetings. So I think in terms of feedback from this group, I'd be curious, and this is feedback that Sue, that maybe you could collect to and send to us, or that we could make ourselves available to. I don't want folks to think this is your only opportunity, but is there any other information or sources of information that you'd like us to consider in determining the areas and communities for public hearings, like the actual locations that we would host the physical in-person meetings? We do intend to also host a virtual meeting. Do you have any feedback about the specific communities that we identified on the list? And then is there any other input, which I think we've been taking already, but is there any other input on public engagement on this rulemaking that you'd like us to consider? So again, we can take the feedback now, or Sue, for the sake of time, if you want, we can put our contact information in the chat. And let me move forward to the timeline quickly, just so folks have that. Right now, we are preparing to initiate the rulemaking with the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules. That hearing would be on July 11th for the ICAR review of the rules. Then it initiates a timeline under the Administrative Procedure Act that's pretty set in terms of the Secretary of State when they publish the notice. And so the notice will be posted online by July 20th in terms of the notice of the location of the hearings and the timelines for the hearings. We're planning to host the meetings between September 5th and the 26th. We pushed this back to a little bit further to try to account for the school year and make sure that we weren't, I know a lot of folks are out in August, so we just want to be mindful of that in terms of timing. And so this is kind of our rough schedule for when we would be hosting in-person meetings and our virtual meeting. The public comment period would be by the end of September. Then the agency would take the month of October to consider the public comments, prepare responses, and finalize the rule document. And our estimated timeline is to finalize the rule by November. And just as a reminder, under the Global Warming Solutions Act, we're required to adopt the rules by December. So that's where this timeline came from. We kind of work backwards from that ultimate deadline. I will stop talking.
There's a lot there. And thank you, Kashka, for raising a lot of issues and others in the chat. There's a lot we could talk about right now, but I think what Rachel's asking us is the locations. I'm sorry if you could at least read them again. You're wondering whether those locations are the ones and whether there are more ways in which we could do the outreach, but you do have a very specific timeline and process for that timeline. Any comments or thoughts at this time to answer those specific questions? And I'm not reading the chat, so please speak up if you wanted that, or someone could read the chat.
I think Indra and Amanda had some good points in there too with, there's a landfill up in Coventry, I think it is, Amanda was talking about. And then also Indra had pointed to Winooski that I think is somewhere, yeah, exactly, Indra, somewhere between maybe Winooski and the Old North End, or married the two somehow. I think that's a good point as well.
And then Chris mentioned Bellows Falls and or Brattleboro as a southern point of.
Well, I think also from a perspective of poverty, Bennington is important.
Yeah, Bennington was on their list. I was just saying, I know the RPCs will be happy to help with outreach on these in those areas too. So just let us know.
And I'm just sort of wondering the general question of, does the Just Transition Subcommittee see a role to play in, helping with the public engagement? So getting the word out there, helping kind of identify some of the messaging and locations, and then helping promote. And then also really specifically thinking about whether frontline communities are particularly being impacted and how to address that, or at least talk about that.
Thanks, Abby. I'm in for Burlington, Winooski, or that area. Absolutely.
That would be great. I think we would really welcome any support in the engagement. I know there's some, I'm hearing and seeing these comments, and I'm hearing them, and we're definitely wanting to take all this into consideration. I'll just mention an interesting nuance that came up at the Transportation Task Group is that when you consider frontline and impacted communities, and then you consider the impact of the rule, I'm forgetting who it was exactly that made this comment, but they said, people that are impacted by the rule itself, the requirements on electric vehicles and the new vehicles that are going to be for sale in Vermont may be different than those that are impacted by climate change. And so we also want to weigh that there may be different sets of communities and constituents that are impacted by the rule, have concerns or questions about the rule, but that are different than the communities that are impacted by climate change and frontline communities. I'm just acknowledging that's something that came up in another meeting that we're considering.
Chris, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just Rachel, as you guys are thinking about presenting this, it's easy to focus on what's going to change. It's also going to be important, and I don't know exactly how this is going to jive with the presentation of information and rulemaking, but the downsides, frankly, the status quo of the dominant of the internal combustion engine. Because yes, EVs are going to be more expensive potentially on the front end, but the maintenance is nothing like a regular internal combustion car. They're much simpler. And the other piece too is if we're dealing with communities with poor air quality, now I'm not exactly sure how emissions from vehicles factors in Vermont and other places where I was a planner and had to really dig deeper into air quality. Here I know we've got issues with wood smoke particulate, but communities where you have a large number of asthma sufferers, internal combustion aren't very friendly to that either. So anyway, not exactly sure how this information is going to be presented, but I think it would be we need to present as much objective information as possible, being really honest about, yeah, the costs, but then these are the risks of the status quo if these things don't change too.
Yeah, and I think just in terms of process for next steps, Sue, I think, we're initially flagging that we want feedback on locations and areas of the meetings because we need to make that decision sooner than later, just so we can give as much notice as possible about where we're going to be hosting the meetings. And then we could certainly circle back with this group and brainstorm, the information to be shared, how we want to, do the engagement, and more like logistics, and also thinking through the substance of how we would engage with the communities that attend and do the outreach about the meetings. But what we do want to lock in is get buy-in about where we want to host them so that we can get the public notice out ASAP. So that's why we're focusing first on location, and then can continue to have conversations about how we do the outreach, ensure that the right people and communities are participating and engaging, what information we want to share. Like, we're open to any of that feedback in terms of materials, frequently asked questions, fact sheets, that kind of thing, but want to start the conversation on location just because of the timeline.
And we want to always remember that language accessibility is front and foremost. Beverly.
Yeah, I may be totally off base here, but in listening to this, it sounds once again like the majority or the status quo are the only people really being considered here. And we're talking about, doing EVs. Well, how is that enough electricity going to be generated without using fossil fuels of some kind? What kind of information is being focused on to reducing consumption? I don't know if it just is because of my background, but it just seems that, the people with money always get to make the decisions. And the only people that are going to really benefit from this is going to be the utility companies. And I'm just sitting here just feeling really, really agitated.
I appreciate that comment. I'm not sure what to say, but I hear you.
I mean, part of that, Beverly, I'll just briefly, I mean, if part of the solution is actually empowering people to be able to generate their own fuel to fuel their own mobility. I mean, I can't pump oil and refine it at my house, but I sure can put up a small enough array to charge my car, or charge a battery to then at night charge my car. And if we can focus on that for everybody, that then gets people off the hook for being dependent on large multinational corporations that are polluting the world. But this is where we need to engage with all the different communities in the state and see, how do you feel about that? Does that even seem like a possibility? Is that anything that you want? But I know it's not necessarily a good solution, but I've lived too many places where I've seen too many streams and mountaintops removed from coal, and I've seen, too many ocean ecosystems destroyed with oil. I'd like to quit seeing that. And if that means getting us off of fossil fuels and the hell that wreaks on everybody. But I know it's not just like a snap your finger and magically all this happens and somebody, yeah, you're right, it's gonna profit more than somebody else. So I'm not saying, I damn sure don't have the solution, but I hate like hell seeing what's going on now.
Chris, I hate seeing what's going on now too. And I have been off grid ever since I've moved to Vermont. And we watch every light, everything that we plug in. But I'm here to tell you that living off solar is not cost-free. It is absolutely not cost-free living in Vermont. It actually costs us more to have backup generation to be able to power our batteries, charge our batteries during the winter. So it's being difficult for me to figure out how, how the people down in South Burlington who are renting are going to be able to do this. How are they going to be able to afford to put arrays on top of their rented houses, much less install the chargers that they need for their cars without having to park their cars 6 blocks away? And, I hear what you're saying. But I don't, the process that's going on here does not seem sustainable to me. And it does not seem that there's any equity and equality in what is happening. Because those people that are renting and that are barely making enough money to feed their children, their voices are totally being disregarded. Totally disregarded. And even if they come to a meeting and talk about what they need, as many did during the Just Transitions year, they're not being listened to.
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for those comments and the difficulty that all of this transition is going to wreak. And to your point, how much many of the folks hardest hit with the least resources may be first impacted potentially negatively. And I think our goal, I think that what this thing is setting is a, in the future goal to move to electric vehicles with the expectation that the electricity is available, that it's renewable, that it's affordable, and all of those things that may or may not be possible. And yet this is setting forward a goal. And I think it's in process. So I guess our question as a group is, how can we help, to your last point, help inform and give voice to those folks who we are concerned about, and many important and unanswerable almost questions that you're raising, Beverly, and we thank you. I do want to just sort of see if we can focus on the Rachel's. One thing is location of these hearings. And then I think the real point to your getting closer to where you were, Beverly, is what's the message and how are we actually reaching people to know about the forums? And frankly, the content of what you can and can't do at those forums and what's the rule really is going to be a lot of meat. And I can see there's something going on in the chat. If someone else could voice that, and I'll just pass it to Kashka. And I'm going to just do a time check. It's almost 20 after 5, and we haven't talked about the Climate Council updates, so we'll make those quick before we get to public comment. Go ahead, Kashka.
Thank you, Sue. So just to Beverly's point, I think she's right. We really have to consider the fact that this is really, even what we're doing right now with the transportation thing, it's just not equitable. And I can't see it. I don't see it becoming more equitable in the next, 13 years. I think that we really have to continue to speak up about it. It's just not. And then the electricity part of it, and then the other thing with EVs, and there are other things going on. For example, the solar flares, which can take out the grid, and the big solar flares are happening in two or three years. The big ones that took out grids all over the world 15 years ago, they happen every 15 years. And that's something the transportation that they don't have any answers for. Now, to Rachel's point, in the Old North End or even Winooski, I was thinking of a couple places, and I don't know if you would rather I emailed you directly or just say them to you right now. I'm not sure what Rachel would prefer, but I think Roosevelt Park is a great place. It's right across from the Boys and Girls Club. It's for the most part, it's our frontline community members that live there, but there's and it's quite a quick shot from Winooski as well. So that was my point to the place where Rachel, one of the places that Rachel was.
Okay, great. Maybe Sue, for next steps. So we do have some time. I think we would like to, I'm not exactly sure when we need to finalize the locations. I think it definitely I think we're hoping to get it before July 11th to determine, to kind of reach agreement on where we want to host them and just get, enough for a public notice in terms of information about location. And then, so maybe Sue, we can coordinate or I could come, I don't know when your next meeting is, but I'll put my email in the chat if you have feedback or specific ideas for locations.
I'd like to recommend that you send an email to Marion, who will send it out to all of us with your memo, because I don't know if we had received that memo beforehand. I hadn't seen it, sorry. And then with the specific questions, so that it'll be a prompt and we all will have an opportunity to respond. And I think that's a great process. And I do want us to kind of move on unless there's one or more, quick comments for Rachel on this. Great. Our next meeting is on the 21st of July. So we're not meeting until, we only meet monthly at this point, Rachel.
Okay, yeah, so I've shared the memo in the chat. I think it's maybe on the website, but I'll send an email to Marion and then welcome, so she can send to you. I'll have my email and you can give me specific about that component. And then maybe at that next meeting, I could come back and we could talk more about
outreach
beyond location. Yeah, we could think more about outreach. So
that sounds good. It's 25 after. We're going to lose Marion, and I want to make sure, Marion, the update on the Climate Council. Does anyone? I think there's some task group members here. Is there anything, Marion, that you were going to present or say before you leave? I know you need to leave at 5:30.
No, I think the updates from public engagement, metrics, and transportation, I'll have reps on this call and would have more current updates than I do. So I would really hand it over to you all and I'll just sign off in a couple minutes.
Okay, very good. And I meant to say thank you to Rachel and to Megan, and I think they're already gone. All right, thanks everybody. And I know we had to sort of move quickly through a very deep conversation, so I apologize for that. Updates. Who would like to step forward? Let's talk about metrics.
I can speak on the metrics. So a lot of us here on this call actually got together for a metrics group meeting. And it was a really good conversation. I guess it was the second meeting, but I wasn't at the first one. So we spent a lot of time talking about the request for proposal that the Climate Council is sending out around the measuring and assessment tool. And we wondered what that entailed. And at the time, we didn't have a copy of it, and whether or not equity was written into this RFP as something that the contractor was going to include, along with metrics around tracking greenhouse gas reductions and other more technical, less people-focused things. So Jane sent us the RFP, and I looked at it quickly. It's very long, but our concern was that we would get a contractor that perhaps didn't have experience in equity measurement and metrics, and that we could suggest to Jane and Marion that be included as part of the evaluation process for the RFP, to make sure the consultants that are selected demonstrate some kind of proficiency or experience in that area. So that was one thing we talked about. And then another thing we talked about was whether or not our group really needed to be developing metrics, as opposed to developing ideas about metrics. Like these are the types of things we would want to know if the actions taken by the council are actually making a difference in anyone's life. Like what kind of metrics would those look like? And then leave it up to the consultant to find out what data is out there, what has baseline information, and how we could move on from there. So some questions. So some questions about like what's actually like what value can we actually contribute as the Just Transition Subcommittee to this process, and where does it make sense to spend our energy? So then we spent some time just brainstorming different metrics to see like what that felt like and what we came up with. And we sort of used the results-based accountability framework of dividing the thinking into how much did you do, how well did you do it, and is anybody better off? And we did not get that far in that process, but I think one of our takeaways was that doing some sort of exercise like that is probably useful, even if it's not included in the measuring and assessment tool. It's useful for us as a Just Transition Subcommittee to hold ourselves accountable to something, or hold the Climate Council accountable to something, and could dovetail into some of our work planning that Abby flagged for later on the agenda that we probably won't get to. Anyway, there's a lot of other really good notes that Claire took, which is why I was grateful to her in the opening chat, because we really talked about a lot. And I think I've been doing like metric and performance accountability work for a long time at the Department of Environmental Conservation, and it is really hard. It's people really struggle with it. So I think it's just part of the process.
I want to, yes, let's flag sort of action steps possibly, but I just wanted to make, did you say that the RFP really doesn't address this, or we don't know whether?
I looked and I found like one spot kind of buried in there that had the word equity. But yeah, I feel like there are probably some improvements that could be made to the RFP if it hasn't already been released.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know how far along it is. There's also something we do in our department, and I don't know if the agency does it or other state agencies do it, but we kind of have this fair share goal where like 5%, we use 5%, but you can use any percent you want of the grant award goes to being a disadvantaged business enterprise, like Black or minority owned. And so that's something minimally we could consider putting in there.
Can you clarify, is this RFP done, or do we have the chance to influence it?
I don't see, I think it is done, like Jane and Marion sort of finished it, but because it involves transferring data, it goes into a state process where it goes to the Agency of Digital Services. And so it may come back to them, but I just like can't speak for them and like whether they're done with their work. But it's not out yet. So if it's not out, that would lead me to believe there's still a chance to change it. But
have you all, have either of them heard that a concern that there's no equity built in there?
No.
Okay.
I was hoping one of them would be here, but Marion's gone already. So I can send an email to Jane and Marion and share the notes from the subcommittee. Jane was kind of like in and out of that meeting because I think her daughter was graduating 6th grade.
How about if we ask you on our behalf to share a concern, as I think Indra has it in the chat, equity needs to be in the core, and we're really worried that it seems to be absent from this. And at this point, I don't know what else we can do but express our concern about it. And Kashka, I see your hand, and then maybe any other thoughts for Carrie on that.
Yeah, just really quick. And also, I know, Carrie, you had mentioned that I think the companies or or who Jane said she might be considering, none of them have any equitable metrics work under their belts. So I think that should also be part of the comment, that any considerations should be with someone who already has work in the equitable environment or something to that effect, and is really
Yeah, I think they could add it to the
Important.
evaluation criteria.
Right.
Yeah.
It could be part of the scoring criteria,
But
like you were
specifically,
suggesting.
spell it out specifically, not just like
Specifically.
experience.
Yeah.
Good. I'm sorry that I want to keep us moving, but we have
Yep.
promised the public for a moment of conversation. If anyone at the in the public wants to offer comment, this is our time for that. Is there anyone here who wants to offer public comment? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone or hearing anyone, so we'll continue with the conversation. Is there more for Carrie on metrics? I'm glad you raised it, and I really support you raising your concerns to them. And I don't know whether there's anything to do in the process, but for sure, they could decide that it's a criteria for evaluating the proposals they get. Okay, moving forward. This is really a time for us to think about what we heard today and maybe think about some priorities for where we go. There was a lot of content in the environmental justice bill that I think and how the guiding principles are utilized. Sarah raised sort of the idea of possibly holding workshops or trainings for state agencies, legislators, or others. You know, that's an interesting idea. We heard a very concrete wish from A&R to facilitate some of the outreach and maybe even some of how they talk about their rulemaking for transportation. And we obviously have an issue. I'm very concerned that Beverly just dropped off and doesn't feel well heard. And I apologize for having to move the agenda forward, but I'm not happy that she's feeling unheard and agitated. Go ahead, Abby.
I just wanted to check to see, Kashka, if you had any updates from the public engagement task group that you wanted to offer before we moved into work planning. And I think work planning is important, and I know we're at that time on the agenda, but if there was just any updates that you wanted to offer to the subcommittee members.
So the public engagement, I don't think I have anything more to report on. We had kind of a small group the last time we met. And we did, I really don't. And then this past Monday, I guess there wasn't one. I think Mona and I were just, Mona and I just kept coming into Zoom and there was nobody there. So I think that nothing to report from my end. I did contact, for Juneteenth, I did contact the directors for the organizers for the Burlington Chittenden County area, or not Chittenden County, just the Burlington area. And I got some really great feedback, and I'm going there this weekend. If anyone has anything other than, if I can grab the mic and send them over to the Vermont, climatechange.vermont.gov page, and that we do want to hear from everyone, how else they could become engaged, just to put a bug in their ear. Please let me know, email me directly if there's anything that you would, if I can grab the mic. That's just if I can grab the mic. So just let me know, because this is where it starts. So that's what I think. But as far as public engagement, I have nothing to report, sorry.
Thanks, and thanks, Abby, for that reminder. What about transportation? I don't know if it might have been what we were just talking about, but is there anything else on transportation? And Chris Campany, being on the steering committee, is there something in the big picture what's happening on the steering committee, what's happening with the climate council that you might report. The climate council as a whole isn't meeting, I don't think, until like September, but the steering committee is. So I don't know if there's something you might like to impart, some wisdom from you about what's happening.
Oh Lord, no wisdom. So I'm on the transportation task force. So let's start with that first. They're trying. So right now, focused on this rulemaking, which is going forward, but there is still just a struggle with how do you actually meet the targets in the absence of the Transportation Climate Initiative, and there's no great answer to that. Anybody else, Carrie, anybody else who I don't know may have been on the meetings, still just trying to figure out what to do to meet those targets. There's no easy solutions. Steering committee really was looking forward about the activities that come in this coming year, and I think a critical one is going to. And I don't know how long, how much longer I'm going to be a counselor. I don't know if I'm going to get re-upped or not. The House members are appointed for 2 years. My time's coming up in October. But I would just encourage this subcommittee to really pay attention to trying to inform the governor's budget on climate council needs, and not just for just transitions, but across all the other subcommittees, to make sure that input is being given to the governor through the agencies in his proposal, because a challenge we ran into this past year was the governor comes out with a budget, and then we had a bit of a back and forth of non-administration members of the steering committee and the council with the administration members about how to deal with this year's budgeting for the council and its work in communicating with the legislature. And so part of that process, frankly, is helping to inform that governor's budget. So I would just encourage this committee to pay attention to that, and to make sure that just transitions needs are reflected in all, depending on whatever this process looks like, whatever the requests are going to be that come out of the different subcommittees, assuming that's going to be part of the process. This may sound really boring, but budgets are the ultimate policy statement. So it's going to be something to pay attention to. So especially I would say the liaisons from the Just Transition Subcommittee to the steering committees really need to engage in that. And I'm not exactly sure what that process is going to look like. But that's not wisdom, but it's strategic advice.
Okay. Something, and I, with respect to the transportation rulemaking, seeing Mona's point on the chat, seeing and hearing Beverly, it occurs to me that at a minimum, we could make a statement that we have a grave concern about some of the impacts to the very communities who we aren't hearing from yet, and how unready folks who aren't able to afford or charge a car are, that we're concerned about our ability to do that in that short period. I'm just putting it out there because I'm wanting to make sure we don't drop these important points. And I don't know if someone might be able to take that idea forward.
Sue, can I add to that? So California is the driver on this, right? No pun intended. They're dealing with the same issues. I mean, Vermont has its own, and we're a more rural state, but California also has extraordinary, very rural areas. They've got apartments. They're dealing with all the same issues. Would it be possible for us to maybe get a guest from California talking about how they are talking about these issues and dealing with them in their own rulemaking? Because I can't imagine they're unaware, and I can't imagine there are groups that are not advocating strongly for equitable solutions through that rule.
We can. The problem right now is nobody probably on this call is going to take that action, but let's put that maybe in an email to Jane and Marion at this point. But the other major player in this is going to be the Climate Action Office. I think that's what it's called. And there will be people, as I understand it, hired to take some of this on. I love that idea. I think we do need to learn, and I think we have to lift up this very serious concern that our members have. And I want to just put that in the notes, and we'll think about when is the right time and how. But thinking also about what our work could be moving forward. Obviously, the rulemaking process is something. What about some of the other ideas about sort of really, and we're making a statement about equity concerns for the metrics, RFP. But what about how do we do more to educate, train our just transitions guiding principles? Any thoughts or interest about that? And it's hard to say that what we want to do without the resources to actually implement. But if we had the ability, how might we want to spend it? Go ahead, Kashka, thanks. And also I want to hear from folks who maybe haven't spoken up yet. Thanks.
Didn't we talk about making a video as well, training video? Didn't we discuss that? Do you guys remember that?
I'm not remembering it, but that doesn't mean anything. Let's put that on the table. Is that an idea? A training video of some sort? Nice. I like that because that's something that can be used a lot. Go ahead, Indra.
This is more of a comment about like how I think we might be able to like really take some action. What if we spend like one of the meeting doing more of a collaborative exercise where everybody brings in their idea about like what is the project that they want to work on? How does that relate to just transition principle? What are the areas where they see collaboration from others? What are the resources that they need? And then collectively we identify different projects and match people with like similar project and whatnot. I can describe the entire exercise, but after attending the first meeting, being at the metrics meeting, and having seen all of the things that we have done, maybe kind of like trying to do that collaborative exercise where we come together, just the way we did it, when we were drafting the just transition principle, might be beneficial if anybody's interested. Like I've facilitated that kind of work, so if there is interest, maybe that would be helpful.
I love that idea. Thank you, Indra. I see Anna and then Sebi. Thanks for speaking up, guys.
Yeah, also just a comment, some thoughts, not necessarily well strung together. I appreciate, Sue, you wanting to circle back to Beverly not feeling heard. I mean, she voiced that she felt agitated, and I think that she didn't feel heard because she wasn't heard. And, just saying, I hear you doesn't mean that you're really listening. And I think that if we're really listening, we need to think about how we can truly listen to the members of our community. How could we act differently in the future so that we were responsive to Beverly's immediate concerns? And it's not just about her. I'm hearing Indra say, let's create space to talk about some of these bigger picture issues where we can come at it from a different angle. And maybe as a group, we can also think about when we want to rely on process and the agenda and the standard, and when we want to say, okay, this is worth pausing for talking about, and at least maybe setting a time for this conversation later, so that we don't fail anybody in our group.
Thanks. That's beautifully put. And my apologies for trying to figure out how to follow an agenda. And I understand that that's not been not done well in terms of being able to be heard. I did try to just say, I like Indra's idea. Let's put that on the map. So when we put ideas out there, what happens is when the folks who try to set up these meetings come back together, we revisit these ideas and set them into the next meeting agenda. And I want to put out there that anyone is welcome to try to set the next meeting agenda. In fact, I'd love to have volunteers to set the next meeting agenda. Frankly, I don't feel like I'm doing a particularly good job because I don't have any time and bandwidth, and I think if others might, I would absolutely be thrilled. So maybe I want to just say that, and Abby and I try to keep this going. But very happy also to cede the facilitating role to others. I'm not feeling particularly good about how this went this evening, and I love what you just shared, Anna, and your spirit. So I accept that, and just want to offer that new leadership would be very welcome and maybe needed. So please put in the chat or send an email to offer if you want to be involved in agenda setting or facilitating. Thanks, everybody. Go ahead, Sebi.
Yeah, a lot to process from the meeting. I was going to bring up something slightly different, potentially. I guess acknowledging Indra's really good suggestion. It seems like Anna, Indra, me, and some of the others just like were appointed after something similar happened that created some of the like priorities that the subcommittee was moving through. I was looking at like in April 21st or something, I think there was a brainstorming session. So I don't know if we want to reflect on that ahead of our future brainstorming session, if there is one. And another point, kind of going back to what Abby was asking kind of near the top of the meeting about the legislative outcomes and where the climate action plan stands and points that Chris has made. I find myself deeply concerned that the Climate Council's plan right now is not doing what we're morally obligated to do, legally obligated to do in terms of the emission reductions themselves, which have a ton of interties with a ton of other things as well. And we need to, part of our charge is paying attention to the equity pieces of that and dimensions of it. But I guess I say that to just say no transition is unjust. And I think that was something that Chris was putting a finer point on also. And I guess insofar as we are representing justice, we need to keep making progress. And so I find myself on the equity metrics task group as well as the transportation task group. And I feel like we also, I know we're holding a lot and there's a lot that we are responsible for, but we also have a role to play in calling out that the plan as it stands without an addendum is not going to get us there, and the status quo right now is horribly inequitable. Chris was talking about the price of heating oil and gasoline, and so yeah, that's for next steps. That's something I'm trying to focus on as a member of this subcommittee too, is like, what is next? Like what, because we're missing some things. So I'll pass it to Indra.
Yeah, I think it's slightly different, but I do want to address, your the idea of not being heard. One thing that I've seen constantly is I don't know if we have a clarity on what our role is. And I think that brings about that, feeling of not being heard more so than anything, because are we advocating? Are we making a decision for the state? Because some of the things that we heard today, like what we should give credit, but in the meantime, like we have heard that repeatedly when we were doing the outreach, it's a constant thing like that we have been hearing. And in the work that we are trying to do now, I am in the committee. Like earlier, it was easier for me to be like, why are we not listening? But now being in the council, I don't know what my role is, right? Like, are we trying to create some noise? Are we trying to influence policy? Can we decide? Like, we don't have a clarity on that role, which as a result, like for the public might make it feel like we're not listening. So I don't think it is anybody's fault that we didn't listen. It's more of like, we hear you. Yes, that's a grave concern. And to my knowledge, having observed all of us, grapple through this question from the beginning, we understand, like we have heard this from a lot of public, but what is our role? Like not having that clarity is probably creating that trouble. So I think if we really start to, create projects that are directed towards the goal, objective, the guiding principle that we have created in the beginning, and they're actionable item more so than just, trying to run through, update just talking about what's happening, I think that might, lead us to another end where such confusion may not exist. So I acknowledge fully, the frustration that Beverly felt, because I have felt that way in many different places. And even in the Dutch Transition Committee, like when we were trying to bring in all the things that we heard in the Northeast Kingdom, in Burlington, we heard those. Like, so, and when we bring it up, like, what is the council gonna do? There's nothing. So I empathize, but in the meantime, I think it is the nature of the work that we are doing that's not allowing us to directly respond. And when people do not get a direct response, it feels like I'm not heard. And I don't know if you're in a position to give that out. So I do want to commend the work that we are doing, and I don't think we should be taking it out, personally or anything. I think it's more about the structure, the role that's created, and the lack of clarity in what we are trying to do. So just wanted to address that, and I'll be quiet now.
No, super helpful. Go ahead, Abby.
Yeah, this is really helpful. And I'm, if I could, I'm just going to do a quick screen share. And I know we only have a few minutes more, so I'm not expecting that we're going to kind of complete this exercise or this task. But hopefully what you can see on the screen is this document on the left, which was the highlighted priorities that came out of that April brainstorm that we did, that you were referencing, Sebi. And we, with support from Jane and Marion, identified who was taking on which of these tasks in either the category of supporting the council's work, supporting kind of the administration and state government, and then work with the legislature. And I think there's probably another category, which is, there's probably maybe more than one category, but these are the ones that came out of that brainstorm. And so the highlighted yellow ones were the areas that Marion and Jane and their team are sort of taking the lead on. The pink items are those that they plan to take on, but the yellow, the blue and the green were either efforts that were being supported by this subcommittee or other work groups. So in particular, the public engagement work group. So you can see that, again, and then there's some that have not yet been highlighted or identified as who may take them on. So what I started to do in this meeting was starting to kind of flesh this out a little bit further into what might become a work plan, which is identifying what are the strategies, what are the specific actions and efforts that this subcommittee wants to take, who may be the responsible party, what's the outcome that we're looking for, and then kind of just off the screen here, you can't see, would be like a timeline that we would be setting for ourselves. And to me, this is, I feel, an important next step, so that we're really have a place that when we have great ideas that come forth in meetings, they're not necessarily just topics for discussion for the next agenda, but they're really put into a document that we then recognize that this fits within a priority strategy that we set for ourselves. This is a very specific action that individuals from our subcommittee or our collaborators are taking responsibility for, and we're really clear about the what, the why, the who, and the when that's going to happen. And I hope that for both those of us that have been on the subcommittee for a period of time and those that are just joining, this really starts to chart a course of what is our role, what is our purpose, what is our kind of responsibility to address kind of some of your questions, Indra. So anyway, I again started to try to take notes in that fashion of things that we've talked about around, so you can see, maybe I'll just now just show this item and blow it up a little bit. These are the items that were again included in that priority summary document. I don't think this is all inclusive. So Indra, I still think it would be great to do an exercise where we identify what the concerns are and the roles that we want to play, because I think we could flesh this out even further, especially knowing where we landed at the end of the legislative session. But the items so far that were included there, as I understood them, was kind of keeping tabs on both the municipal vulnerability index and the mapping tool that's now in Act 154 to ensure that there's this inclusion of equity metrics, having engagement from our subcommittee members in the transportation and the biomass task groups, continuing to proactively work towards public engagement with non-English speaking community members, serving as this voice or translator for marginalized populations, that have not been engaged or involved in discussions that the legislature, the state government, or the Climate Council have facilitated. This is the training piece, so sharing and or hosting trainings for those various audiences. And I think we could probably add to this that just the general public and population. And then I added this one as well, because I've heard us talk about this as one of our kind of mainstays, which is ensuring the utilization of the just transition principles in ongoing planning and tracking efforts. And then again, starting to try to outline some of the specific actions that I think I heard us discuss today. So I don't know if this is helpful for anyone, but I wanted to just do a quick share of kind of what I was imagining around a work plan and how that could help this subcommittee, and it's all of us as members feel like we have direction and focus. Yes,
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I just acknowledge that if I'm feeling tired after this meeting, I think other people might be as well. So I may not articulate this very well, but I really like this, Abby. I think it can help us feel some forward movement, which I feel like sometimes is what's frustrating about this subcommittee, is that we can feel like we're spinning our wheels. So I appreciate using a tool like this to help us see how we're taking action and moving something. I also really like Indra's idea, in part because I feel like we have a lot of new members and we're in a new phase of work. And I feel like if I go back to some basics, we're doing a little reforming, right? Because we do have some new members, we have lots of members. And I think it could be really helpful to have more opportunity, recognizing that it may feel a little bit like repeat, but more opportunity for this new version of paper to talk about what this group is interested in moving forward. And so it almost is like an iterative version of your document as opposed to just, so I wonder if we could do kind of a both and approach. And I just really value that Sue and Abby and staff, you're going to have to take tonight's meeting and help us figure out how to move forward productively. And I'm happy to try to continue to think with you all about that. Indra, if you have a vision, I would just say, Indra, if you have a vision for an activity that you think could be helpful, I know I've always really appreciated when you've stepped in and facilitated those, because it's given a great opportunity for other people's voices to come up. So I would love to see that. So I'll just leave that there.
Thanks. Go ahead, Sebi. And I'm just a time check. We only have a couple minutes here.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, it's just kind of like a process question, because I also want to help. I think I heard at our orientation that like we can't share documents. I was thinking of like co-creating an agenda. Is that true? Because it's like public quorum. Like we can't have like a Google document that we're trying to like craft together. So a lot of the follow-up just practically is going to be like emails.
But what we could do is have a meeting of a smaller group who actually takes the next step of working on bringing Abby's document, working on it a little bit and maybe adding to it, and then sort of presenting back to the whole group for more. And maybe, I think that those ideas really come from where we have been. But to your point, Sarah, we're at a new place. And it would be, for example, to put out there, should we be making the point that we're not going to make the cut without some of the things that didn't pass, and that's a real concern of ours, and ongoing concerns that some of the objectives, assume everyone can benefit from these, and we're very concerned that they won't, whatever. I don't know if that's the right way to consider it, but we can add to that. So maybe what would be great is if we could have folks volunteer to be on a little subcommittee to help move the work plan forward, so that when we next come together, we have a document to feed back on. Would that work? And maybe Abby, you should convene that, since you've got the document started. Sounded like Indra might be interested, Sebi might be interested. I don't know if others, I haven't been able to watch the chat. I also really want to seed the facilitating. Anna, I would love to see if you would be interested in facilitating. I think there's no reason why Abby and I need to. It's just been sort of our norm, and I'm quite concerned about my ability to keep doing all of that. So I'd love for anyone else to do that. We could share that role more.
I'd be happy to share it in general. I don't have a lot of facilitation experience, and I would love to at least have 1 or 2 more meetings and absorb.
Yeah, and it is a whole thing to do it online. Okay, I'm just putting it out there. Maybe Indra could be a facilitator since he seems to have a lot of experience. It's 6 o'clock. Chris is in a beautiful place to enjoy, it sounds like. Okay, we have made a few decisions, I think, here, and I appreciate everybody's input, especially new voices. Abby, can you help maybe convene a group to work on that work plan before the next meeting? Would that be doable? I don't want to put something on you that you can't do.
Let's see. So I just to make sure I understand, are we talking about setting the agenda? So it sounds like there's a couple things. There's setting the agenda for the next meeting, but then there's also kind of doing some finalization of, or next phase of the work plan. I was sort of thinking that maybe we wouldn't try to finalize the work plan until after the brainstorming session, Indra, that you're suggesting for the July meeting. So maybe my suggestion might be that we bring a few more folks into the agenda setting meeting, or a few of us, Indra included, have a brainstorm around how to do this exercise of kind of capturing both the past and where we want to move forward, where we want to go as a subcommittee, and make sure that we just create real intention around that in the agenda. And then maybe we look at the next, before the August meeting, of kind of finalizing a work plan. Does that resonate with folks?
Abby, I think you could. I also know how hard it can be to pull people together to work on something. So I just want to say, I really like the tool, that work plan tool that you've drafted.
Okay.
I think it's great, and I think you could work it into the next agenda, even if it has a big old draft across it, just to say, and I'm going to update this based on tonight's meeting, and this is the tool that we're going to keep using, rather than kind of push it off again. That would be my only friendly amendment to what you proposed. I think it sounds great.
Great. I think that's probably a good suggestion, to not push it for another whole month. Okay, so yes, then I'm happy to help pull together a small team that may just be Indra and myself, and anyone else who's interested. I too may have missed if there was interest, and Sebi, great, to look at the work plan together. And I was trying to see when our meeting is to develop the agenda for our July 21st meeting, and I'm not seeing it quickly on my calendar. There's so
It's
many
usually
things.
the week before or 2 weeks before, right? It's every other. So why don't we put that out as an email and say, let us know if you'd like to be a part of developing the next agenda. And that way people can be involved if they're interested.
Okay.
Great.
I know we're done, but there was this idea about a letter that could kind of maybe give voice to a collective sentiment that, because Brenda really was expressing and some others about just that the rule, the process, we think there's problems with it, and just expressing that really clearly in writing. I don't know if Chris was off. Somebody made that suggestion. I think that's a good idea. Amanda was going to drop that. Okay. I didn't want to lose that.
All right. Amanda, did you just, oh, she waved to say goodbye. I thought she had waved to say I did it. All right. I didn't catch that. I'm sorry about the rule comment, but I think maybe some letter of concern is very appropriate. And if Chris offered to do that, I'd love for him to do it. I missed that. And Sarah, I'm sorry, right now it's hard to hear you exactly. Sebi, you had the last word. Go for it.
It was just about that letter. I guess I'll look forward to seeing a draft, if there is one. But
What if you reach out to Chris and say, hey, at the end of the meeting, we said, let's work on that. Do you want to work on it together kind of thing? Then I bet that would be a great prompt.
okay, and the message being we're concerned about the federal rule that requires us to adopt yes or no, and also EV accessibility. I guess I see this rule as essential that we do it. And I feel like there's a little bit of confusion about it. So concern about the implementation of getting EVs to Vermont, basically, and also the fact that we have public engagement required around something that it's yes or no.
Yeah, I think it's like, is this an appropriate way to engage people on this?
Yeah, I
Is
think
it
it's a
not
weird
meaningful?
accident of the law. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just because this is a very specific kind of rule. I don't know.
I
Okay,
don't know that,
yes,
yeah. Well,
I will follow up with Chris.
I'm happy, Sabby, I'm happy to follow up with you and Chris and figure out how to thread the needle, to really give voice to what are some really important, I think, shared concerns, even if certain people want the rule or don't want the rule. I think there are some collective concerns.
Right, yeah.
All right. It is 6:07. I want to thank everyone for participating and hanging in. I think we've got some good ideas, momentum for agenda setting and reconvening with a work plan in process, and have a clear way to approach that. Thank you so much, Abby, for that good tool. And everyone, thank you and have a great evening. Take care.
You too all.
Bye, everyone.